The corridors of that clinic were a heavy silence. The clock on the wall emitted an unbearable ticking, but no one seemed to notice. Everyone there was too distracted, either with the endless forms, the test tubes filled with fluorescent liquids, or the discomfort that seemed to stick to the skin like cold sweat. I didn't want to be there. But like most people who enter pharmaceutical testing programs, I didn't have many choices. I had been unemployed for months, and after nights of debating with myself, I decided that the easy money was worth the risk. Just a few injections, maybe 1 or 2 days of side effects. That's what they promised me during the interview. I still remember the doctor who first saw me, Dr. Moore. She had a sharp smile. She was the one who administered the injections and asked the routine questions. Any allergies? History of seizures? Heart problems? My automatic no seemed to satisfy her. In the waiting room, I observed the other participants. Some seemed anxious, others pretended to be calm, but no one was really relaxed. There was something in their eyes that made me feel less alone. We weren't that different. Too young to be tired of life, but old enough to feel its weight. The protocol was simple. 3 nights at the clinic, monitored 24 hours a day while they tested the drug's effects. Each room had cameras, alarms, and an intercom that connected us directly to the medical team. The place felt more like a cross between a hospital and a prison, with fluorescent white lights illuminating everything, but in a way that made shadows seem darker than they should have been. The first night, everything seemed normal. I felt a slight tingling in the arm where they had administered the injection, but nothing special. The dinner was bland, but nutritious, as if they were afraid of interfering with the test with any off-standard ingredients. Afterward, they told us to rest, and I went to my room. The bed was hard. The pillow was too thin. Still, I slept. At least, I think I slept. When I woke up, the clock in the corner of the room read 3:03 in the morning, and there was something strange. I couldn't remember what I had dreamt. It was as if my mind had completely erased those hours. Fine, I knew that wasn't uncommon. But the feeling that stayed with me was, it wasn't a peaceful emptiness, like the one you feel when waking from a deep sleep, but something oppressive, as if my brain had worked hard to forget something that should have been remembered. On the second day, I realized I wasn't alone in this feeling. During breakfast, I sat next to a woman named Erica, who seemed just as tired as I was. I asked her if she had slept poorly too, trying to break the ice. "It's not that I slept badly," she said, stirring her coffee. "It's just that I don't know if I really slept." It was a disturbing thought. Later, I overheard rumors among the participants. One of them, a guy named Lucas, swore he had seen someone enter his room while he was sleeping. He said he woke up with a shadow in the corner of the room, but when he turned on the light, there was nothing there. It must have been the monitoring, one of the others suggested, trying to rationalize. At night, before trying to sleep, I started to think about it. I wasn't the type to believe in ghost stories, but there was something in Lucas' tone that made it seem like he wasn't lying. Still, I lay in bed and tried to push the thought away. I was exhausted, but every time I closed my eyes, I felt something strange. When I finally fell asleep, terror caught me by surprise. I woke up in the middle of the night with rapid breathing. It was as if my body had detected a hidden threat and triggered an internal alarm. The room was in absolute silence. I looked at the clock, 2:47 in the morning. By this time, the ticking of the clock sounded more like a hammer, pounding into my mind something I still didn't understand. I got up and pressed my face to the camera in the corner of the room. I knew someone was watching me from the other side. I whispered softly, almost hopelessly, "What's happening here?" The next morning started strangely. There was something wrong with that place, and I wasn't the only one to feel it. When I entered the common area for breakfast, all the participants looked exhausted, with dark circles so deep they seemed tattooed. I sat next to Erica again. She had a pale face, and her hand trembled as she stirred her coffee. It wasn't until a few seconds of silence that she finally said something. I dreamt about something horrible. At least, I think it was a dream. I was about to ask more, but Lucas entered the room with an expression that made the air freeze. He walked up to the medical team's table, shouting something about lies, and this isn't safe. The doctors tried to calm him down, but he seemed on the verge of a breakdown. The following morning started off oddly. There was something wrong in the air, and I wasn't the only one feeling it. When I entered the common area for breakfast, all the participants looked exhausted, with dark circles so deep they seemed tattooed. I sat down next to Erica again. She had a pale face, and her hand trembled as she stirred her coffee. It wasn't until a few seconds of silence that she finally said something. I dreamt about something horrible. At least, I think it was a dream. I was about to ask more, but Lucas entered the room with an expression that froze the air. He walked up to the medical team's table, shouting something about lies, and this isn't safe. The doctors tried to calm him down, but he seemed on the verge of collapse. I saw her. He shouted, his voice hoarse. She was in the corner of the room. She looked at me like she knew I wouldn't wake up in time. We looked at each other, confused and scared. Before we could ask what he meant, 2 security guards appeared and took him out of the room. Meanwhile, I started paying more attention to the clinic. The walls had a shade of white that was too much. The always spotless corridors had a faint smell of disinfectant, but mixed with something chemical and metallic. It was as if everything there had been carefully designed to calm us, but somehow did the opposite. When Dr. Moore came to get me for my daily checkup, I tried to ask about Lucas. She just looked away and said that he had left the program. He was fine yesterday, I insisted. What happened? He decided he didn't want to continue. This happens, she replied, without much emotion. But I didn't believe her. During the checkup, as she checked my vital signs and asked questions, I noticed something in her tone. She was less confident than on the first day. Her forced smile seemed like a mask that didn't quite fit her face. I nodded, and she pulled me aside. There, in the empty hallway, Erica told me about her dream, or what she thought was a dream. I was in my room, but it looked different. There was something in the corner, something dark, watching me. I tried to move, but my body didn't respond. Then I felt like something was stealing parts of me. When I woke up, I was exhausted. Like I hadn't slept at all. She looked me in the eyes, searching for some validation, and I didn't know what to say. Because deep down, I knew exactly what she was talking about. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the camera in the corner of the room, feeling like something was hidden there, something that only revealed itself when no one was looking. The clinic, which at first seemed like just a sterile and impersonal place, now seemed something much more dangerous. Every sound in the corridors, a creaking of metal, muffled footsteps, the distant hum of equipment sounded like an omen. I began noticing details that had previously gone unnoticed. For instance, the emergency lights flickered erratically in some areas, and the intercom in my room made strange noises, as if there was static mixed with distorted voices. And then, in the middle of the night, something happened that broke me from my stupor. I was lying down, my eyes heavy but resisting sleep, when I heard a noise. It was faint, but constant, coming from the hallway. I slowly got up and walked to the door. I pressed my ear to it, staying still, trying to identify the sound. It was like something being dragged across the floor. I carefully opened the door, just enough to look out. The hallway was empty, but the feeling that I wasn't alone was palpable. When I returned to bed, I found something on the pillow that hadn't been there before, a small circular mark, as if someone had pressed a gloved finger there. I lay down, but couldn't close my eyes for the rest of the night. The next morning, Erica didn't show up for breakfast. When I asked the staff, they said she had also left the program. But I knew that wasn't true. I knew something was wrong, something none of us would be able to understand. Yet, that morning, the atmosphere in the clinic had completely changed. It wasn't just the exhaustion that hovered over us like a predator, but also a strange silence, almost ritualistic. The doctors spoke less, and when they did, it was in low tones, as if afraid someone might overhear. The few of us, Erica, Lucas, the others, they just disappear. I didn't know what to say. Because he was right. There was no explanation. Just those forced smiles and rehearsed apologies from the medical staff. Later, during the daily checkup, I decided to be more direct. When Dr. Moore entered the room with her clipboard, I asked the question that had been haunting me since the first night. What happens when someone leaves the program? She raised her eyes, slightly surprised, but quickly returned to her cold professionalism. They are removed, taken for external evaluation. There's nothing to worry about. Then why doesn't anyone say anything? Why don't they say goodbye? This time, she hesitated. Just for a second, but it was enough for me to know. She was hiding something. It's part of the contract. Confidentiality is crucial, she replied, trying to close the subject. But as I left the room, I noticed something. On the clipboard she was holding, for an instant, I saw a list. My name was there, along with others, and next to two names, Lucas and Erica, there was a small red X. That night, things finally started to unravel. I was sitting on the bed, trying to calm my mind, when I heard again the sound I had heard the night before. A slow, methodical dragging, coming from the hallway. This time, however, I didn't hesitate. I went to the door and opened it carefully. The hallway was empty, but the sound continued, as if it were moving farther away. I stepped out barefoot, following the sound. The further I went, the stronger the feeling of danger grew. The clinic seemed different at night. The hallways seemed longer, the shadows thicker, and there was a strange smell in the air, something between disinfectant and burnt flesh. The sound led me to a door at the end of the hallway, which was locked. However, as I got closer, I heard something from the other side. It wasn't the sound of something being dragged. It was a breath, low and irregular, as if something was there, waiting. I ran back to my room, my heart pounding. But before I could lock myself in, the camera in the corner blinked a red light and the intercom crackled. "Mr. Miller, please return to your room immediately," said a male voice, cold and emotionless. I stopped, staring at the camera. I didn't know how to respond, so I simply closed the door and sat on the bed. The minutes dragged on like hours. When I finally managed to relax a little, the sound started again. But this time, it was inside the room. My heart froze. I turned my head slowly and saw, in the corner of the room, something that shouldn't be there. A shadow darker than the others, a form that made no sense. Blinking, I tried to convince myself it was my imagination. But the shadow moved. It was slow, almost imperceptible, but it was getting closer. When I tried to get up, my body wouldn't respond. It was as if something invisible was pressing me back into the bed. That's when the voice came. Not through the intercom, but in my head. "Don't fight it." Waking up isn't a choice. My body trembled, every muscle paralyzed in a state of absolute panic. But then, suddenly, the feeling disappeared, and when I looked again, the shadow was gone. I spent the rest of the night awake, my gaze fixed on the corner of the room, waiting for it to return. The next morning, I went straight to Daniel. I told him what had happened, trying not to sound like a madman. He listened in silence, but I could see in his eyes that he believed me. "I think I know where they're taking people," he finally said. "Tonight, we need to find out the truth, before it's too late." When night fell, Daniel and I met in my room, the only place where we felt we could talk without being heard, even though we weren't sure about that either. He brought a map of the clinic that he had apparently grabbed at the reception on the first day, something I didn't even know existed. "Look at this," he started, pointing at the map. "This wing here doesn't appear in any of our tours or exams, but it's where they take people when they disappear." Looking closer, I realized he was right. There was a whole section marked as restricted, accessible only by an elevator at the end of a hallway we rarely used. "Are you sure?" I asked, still trying to absorb the plan he was starting to sketch out. "I heard something," he replied. "After Erica disappeared, I stayed awake and followed one of the doctors. He entered that elevator, and after a few minutes, well, I heard screams. There was something in the way he said screams that made my spine freeze." "And you think we can get in there?" Daniel smiled, but there was no humor in his expression. "If we stay here, we won't last another night. I'd rather take the risk than wait." The plan was simple but risky. During the security shift change, we would head to the elevator and try to go down. He had managed to get a magnetic card from one of the assistants, although we didn't know if it would work. As the time approached, I began to question everything. What if we were overreacting? What if it was just paranoia caused by the stress of the experiment? But then I remembered the shadow, the dragging sound, and the feeling of being watched. At the agreed time, we left. The hallways were silent, but the silence was so intense it felt like a scream. Every step seemed too loud. Every movement seemed to expose us. When we reached the elevator, Daniel swiped the card on the reader. For a moment, nothing happened. We looked at each other, panic starting to rise. But then the green light flashed, and the doors opened with a sound that echoed like thunder. We quickly entered, and Daniel pressed the button for the basement. We didn't know what we would find down there, but the feeling of descent was like falling into an abyss. When the doors opened, the air changed. It was colder, denser, as if something invisible was watching us. The fluorescent light flickered intermittently, creating shadows that seemed to move on their own. "What is this?" I whispered, although my voice seemed too loud in the silence. The hallway in front of us seemed endless, with steel doors lined on both sides. Some had small windows, but most were closed. However, one door was slightly ajar, and from it came a sound, like low, contained crying. Daniel and I exchanged glances before approaching. He slowly opened the door, and inside we found a small room with padded walls. In the center, sitting on the floor, was Lucas. But he was no longer the Lucas we knew. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, as if he hadn't slept in days or years. He muttered something to himself repeatedly, while his hands trembled uncontrollably. "Lucas," I called, trying not to scare him. "What happened to you?" He slowly lifted his eyes, and what I saw in them was pure terror. "She's here," he whispered. "She never leaves." Before we could ask more, we heard heavy footsteps coming from the hallway. Daniel quickly shut the door, gesturing for us to remain silent. The footsteps stopped in front of the door, and then we heard Dr. Moore's voice. "I know you're in there. Don't make this harder for us." Her tone was different now, cold and authoritative, with no attempt at politeness. Daniel looked at me, and I knew what he was thinking. Run. But before we could react, the door was slammed open, and two security guards grabbed us. They were too strong for us to resist, and before we knew it, we were being dragged down the hallway. "What are you doing here?" Dr. Moore asked as she walked beside us. Her expression was grim, almost disappointed. I tried to argue, but she just shook her head. "You don't understand. This isn't about you. It's about her." Before we could ask who she was, we were shoved into a larger room. Inside, there were monitors showing every room in the clinic, including ours. But what caught my attention was one particular screen, where something dark and distorted seemed to move. "You awakened something," she said. "And now you'll have to face the consequences." I didn't know what was more terrifying, the fact that we hadn't been able to escape the room, or what we saw next. The monitor flickered once more, and what appeared on the screen was no longer a distorted image. It was something real, something that was there with us, in the same room. The figure stood in one of the shadows in the back, almost invisible. But unlike the other images, this shadow was moving. Slowly, over time, the figure revealed more. It started with a slight movement of hair, an arm shifting, until the figure took shape. I recognized that person. It was Erica. But it wasn't the Erica we knew. Her eyes were completely white, her skin pale, and she seemed to float, moving strangely, as if the space around her was distorted. The feeling of being watched grew stronger. You said she was," Daniel stammered, pointing at the screen. Dr. Moore watched the image with unsettling calm. "She's not here anymore. She's somewhere else now. And you'll join her soon." I felt dizzy, as if her words had a weight I couldn't comprehend. The terror was about to consume everything, and the idea that death was just around the corner felt more real than ever. She approached me and whispered, "What happened had to happen. You can't escape, not now. Not after what you've done." I looked at Daniel, his eyes wide, lost. He no longer looked the same, his muscles tense, his lips dry. He grabbed my arm tightly, trying to stay firm, but I knew he was sinking into the same panic I was. I tried to speak, but I couldn't. Fear swallowed my voice. "It was you who was watching us, wasn't it?" Daniel said angrily, though his voice trembled. "You knew all of this." Dr. Moore didn't bother to answer. She simply turned on her heels and walked over to the table, where there was a stack of papers. With a sharp gesture, she grabbed one and handed it to us. "The cure is here," she said, still emotionless. "But you don't have much time." I looked at the paper. It was a list of numbers and more numbers, with no clear meaning. Then the truth hit me. The cure wasn't for us. It was a trap, a game. Something deeper was at play here than I could have ever imagined. "It's too late," she continued, now looking directly at me. "You can't escape this. The rules have changed. There is no way out." The room seemed to shrink with every word, the air growing thicker and more suffocating. I felt that death was about to reach us, one way or another. Daniel looked frozen. He looked at me, as though searching for some way to escape. But his gaze faltered, and I knew he no longer believed it was possible. Fear spread between us like a virus, and before I could think of anything else, Erica's figure, or whatever she was now, appeared again on the screen. She was closer this time, almost as if she were walking into the room. "You have to understand," Dr. Moore whispered, moving closer slowly. "It's not about survival. It never was." The sound of her voice seemed to make the space around us begin to crumble. I no longer knew what was real. When I turned my attention back to Daniel, I saw him pulling away from me, his eyes fixed on the screen. He was in a trance. It was as if he were no longer there, as though he had crossed some boundary I couldn't comprehend. "Daniel, no," I shouted, trying to pull him back. But he didn't hear me. He began walking, his feet heavy and dragging, towards the door. The panic on his face was gone, replaced by a disturbing calm. Dr. Moore just watched, doing nothing to stop him. I screamed for him, but he didn't turn. I knew what that meant. He wasn't just leaving. He was surrendering. Before I could run to him, the door slammed shut behind him with a bang, and the room fell silent again. I was alone now, and the feeling of despair was maddening. I stood still for a few seconds, only hearing the sound of my breath and the echo of the door slamming. What I had witnessed didn't make sense. Daniel's empty gaze before he disappeared through the door. It was as if he had been sucked into some distant place with no chance of coming back. There was no more panic, no more anger. Just an absolute void. With trembling hands, I took the paper Dr. Moore had given me. It was a list of numbers, meaningless codes. My brain tried to connect the dots, but nothing seemed to make sense. Only a mix of frustration and fear overtook me. If Daniel had left without protest, what did that mean for me? I was still here. Could I still escape? But there was something else. Something deep in my mind told me there was no escape. I saw Dr. Moore in the corner of the room, watching, as if she were waiting for me to take some kind of action. She wasn't smiling anymore. There was a coldness in her gaze, an unshakable calm, as if everything had already been decided, as if I were already a piece in a game that had no rules. Why didn't you tell me? What's going on here? My voice sounded weaker than I wanted, but it was all I could manage. I needed answers. I needed to understand what was happening. She slowly approached, and in an almost deafening tone, began to speak. You don't understand, do you? This isn't about you or any of the others. This is bigger than any of you. I tried to process her words. Bigger than everything I knew. Was she talking about a conspiracy? Or perhaps something more insane? These tests, this drug, they weren't just trying to cure something. They were trying to control. She seemed more than ever detached from reality. Her gaze wandered into the air as she spoke, as if she were already thinking of something beyond my understanding. You have to understand. The people behind this, they were trying to create control. Do you get it? They were testing the limits. The floor seemed to disappear beneath me. My stomach churned with her words. What did she mean by control? Suddenly, the words began to make sense, but with a meaning I didn't want to understand. These people, they don't want you just to stay awake. They want you to disappear. I stared at her, trying to understand. What was she saying? Was this a game? An experiment gone wrong? Or was the experiment exactly that? To keep the subjects in a constant state of fear, of imminent death. Dr. Moore took a step forward, grabbed my arm with force, and looked me directly in the eyes. You think you're here to survive, but it's too late for that. What's left for you now is to accept the truth. I recoiled, her touch making me shiver. She was right. What was happening here no longer made sense. It was as if reality were distorting before my eyes, as if nothing was real. My gaze was drawn to the monitor screen again. Erica's figure was there, standing, expressionless, in an almost translucent version of herself. I didn't know if she was dead or if, somehow, she was still here, connected to something greater, something beyond human comprehension. My mind spun in circles. I wanted to understand, but all I saw was a labyrinth of lies and fears. And if somehow this was all one big experiment, what would happen to us if we couldn't sleep? Would we not just die, but lose our identity, lose our humanity? I need to get out of here. I need to leave now. My voice trembled, But the decision was clear. Dr. Moore watched me with an enigmatic smile. "There's nowhere to go," she said calmly. "If you leave, you'll find out what the real end is." I wanted to scream, to fight against her, against whatever this cursed clinic was. But something inside me, a cold sensation, stopped me. I knew she was right. There was something else waiting for me out there. Something that might be worse than staying here. The silence returned, heavy. Dr. Moore moved away, leaving me there with my dark thoughts. I was alone again, and the feeling that death wasn't the only threat began to take over me. I didn't know what to do, didn't know where to go. But one thing was certain. I had to escape. A feeling of despair grew in me, crushing any trace of reason. I looked at the numbers on the paper Dr. Moore had given me, desperately trying to find any pattern. But all I saw were sequences of random symbols, mocking my attempt to understand what was happening. Daniel's mind had, somehow, already been broken. He had surrendered to the fear, to the idea that nothing mattered anymore. I had seen him disappear through that door, but at the same time, a part of me didn't believe he was really lost. What I knew was that he wasn't the same anymore. Something inside him had changed, and maybe, if he had been strong enough, he could have resisted. Or maybe he was beyond that, beyond any salvation. If he didn't come back, he's not coming back, I whispered to myself, trying to shake those words from my mind, but they kept echoing in the back of my head. I knew staying there waiting for a solution would do nothing. Dr. Moore had already shown me the worst, and any move toward an answer seemed pointless. But there was something else, something I could control, something that didn't depend on her. It was my will to survive. Even if the odds were against me, even if fear and doubt tried to swallow me whole, I still had one choice: to fight. The decision came without warning. When the door to the room opened, Dr. Moore appeared, as calm and impassive as always. "Do you still think you can escape?" she said, her voice calm, almost bitter, as if she already knew the answer. "You'll die trying. It's already been decided." It wasn't just a threat. It was a sentence. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of those words crushing my chest. She was right, to some extent. I didn't have much time. Death was already lurking, and the only thing that could change the course of things was facing whatever came next. "If that's how it's going to be, then so be it," I said, trying to remain calm. "But I'll fight until the end." Dr. Moore didn't answer. She just watched me with a distant look, as if she were waiting for something. As if she knew, on some level, that she had already won. It wasn't about survival anymore, but a psychological game in which she was in control. I had no choice. The only thing that could save me now was what lay beyond that room, beyond this cursed clinic. I needed to leave. I needed to figure out what was going on before it was too late. With a hesitant step, I started moving toward the door. Every sound of my feet on the floor felt like a scream of hopelessness, echoing through the empty room. I knew I couldn't trust anyone there, but the desire for freedom was stronger than the fear that consumed me. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't turn back. Every movement felt like it was bringing me closer to the truth, to the heart of a mystery I didn't understand, but that I needed to solve. Because if I stayed there, doing nothing, death would come, and it wouldn't just be physical death. It would be the death of the spirit of sanity. When I reached the door, Dr. Moore approached me. "You don't understand," she said, her tone calm, but carrying a pain that seemed to emanate from her own soul. "You'll never understand," but I didn't stop. I couldn't. I was already in a race against time, against everything threatening me. It was the last trace of hope I had, and I couldn't let it slip away. With a quick movement, I pushed the door open and crossed into the corridor. The silence immediately enveloped me, and I felt the weight of the darkness. But something inside me woke up. It was as if I had found a new strength, a determination that hadn't existed before. The lights in the corridor were dim, flickering intermittently. I could barely see where I was going, but instinct guided me. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel the adrenaline taking over my body. Each step echoed in the emptiness, amplified by my own anxiety. I was heading toward something, but I didn't know exactly what. Suddenly, I heard a sound behind me, a door slamming shut. My feet stopped for a second, but I quickly continued walking. I wasn't going to look back anymore. I wasn't going to be held by whatever that nightmare was. As I approached a turn in the corridor, I realized I wasn't alone anymore. A soft sound, like a contained breath, echoed in the shadows. When I turned the corner, I saw a figure, a strange, distorted silhouette that quickly moved into a room to the left. I stopped immediately, panic rising like ice in my stomach. What was that? It wasn't human. Or at least, it didn't seem to be. Something about that movement, that form, didn't make sense.